transition from that, but I wanted to pray for those things this morning. I remember back a few years ago, there was a big football game. Now, I know some of you hate me for this because I'm a New England Patriots fan. Some of you can't handle that because the Seahawks and all of that. But it's true. I'm a New England Patriots fan, and we had a Super Bowl party at my house just a couple years back. And the New England Patriots were playing against, the Atlanta Falcons. And I remember that game was so difficult. The first half, the Patriots couldn't do anything right, throwing interceptions, just making mistakes all over the place. And the Falcons were just like having the will, taking the game down. And they were up 23-3 by halftime. And Susanna, one of the ladies in our church, was hanging out with us at the Super Bowl party. She looks at me and she says, "Hey, Pastor Phil, do you think I should hang out or should I leave now?" I said, "Well, you're welcome to hang out, but you know what? I've never seen any team come back in halftime from 23-3. And she goes, "Okay." So she ends up leaving. Poor girl, because the game just began. And after halftime, the Patriots started to do all their stuff, and they scored a few more touchdowns. And finally, at the end, right near the end of the game, they finally scored the last points, and they won the game, and it was exciting. Well, maybe for me, maybe not for the rest of you, but it was exciting. And I remember that game. In fact, now, whenever I go back to rewatch that game, I know that the Patriots have won. And I can sit there and even somehow emotionally I get involved in the game again, and I start getting nervous because, oh no, they're losing. But then I remember that I already know how this is going to end. I know this is going to end, that the Patriots are going to win this game, no matter if it doesn't look like that in this moment. And I think that's a really good illustration for us this morning as we look at prophecy. Part of why prophecy is so powerful is because it shows us that God is in control, that He knows what's coming next, and we can place our faith in Him. In fact, He knows the beginning from the end. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the creator of all things. And because God is these things, God knows what's going to happen next. And so in prophecy, He starts to give us a few hints, a few clues. He starts to show us some of the things that will happen next. And as a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ and one who places my faith in God, I know that I can have confidence not in myself, but in Him. And I know at the end we're going to win because He is stronger than everything. And so this is what kind of happens in prophecy. We've been talking about Daniel chapter 8 the last couple of weeks, and I wanted to kind of look at this little chart here on the screen. And this chart helps us to see some things about prophecy. Pastor Isaac had preached several months back on Daniel chapter 2, and he talked about the dream that was given to Nebuchadnezzar. And so when Nebuchadnezzar had this amazing dream, his second dream, he had of these 4 different sections of this large statue: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And we saw that in that statue that these are 4 kingdoms: the Babylonian kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire, and then there was the Greek Empire, and then finally the Roman Empire. Well, then later on in Daniel chapter 7, Pastor Isaac also spoke on this. You want to go back and online and check that out. You'll see that there were 4 beasts. And interestingly enough, these 4 beasts correlate exactly with the 4 kingdoms that were going to come later on. And so what we know is that the prophecies about the end times begin at Babylon, because that's when they were given, and then they end at the very end when everything is taken care of. But in Daniel chapter 8, we were talking about 2 different creatures that were prophesied about. The vision that Daniel had was that of a ram with 2 horns, and then a goat with 1 primary horn that breaks off later and then become 4 horns afterwards. And these prophecies are about things that are in the middle. So it's interesting. We're going to get back to this later on. But remember, the prophecies are about things in the middle, but then things are said in this prophecy that point to the end. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And so we look at Daniel chapter 8. We also see this other thing here, this other next chart that we have. What we see is in Daniel chapter 8, those are the 2 kingdoms that were here, the 2-horned ram, okay? That was the Medo-Persian Empire. And Daniel was writing somewhere around here, like 544 or 545. We're not exactly sure of the date when he wrote that Daniel chapter 8. But when he wrote it, it was just a couple years later, maybe 5 years later, boom, then the Medes came in and they took over, and the Medo-Persian Empire was for quite a while, over 200 years. And then the Greeks came in, and Alexander the Great came in, and he was amazing. And in 10 years, he took over the known world. And of course, at 33, he died. But in the Greek Empire, was broken up into not just the goat now with one major horn that was broken off, but 4 horns. And then we were talking about here in Daniel 8 last week, you can go back and listen to the message, that one of those horns started small, and it grew stronger and became larger than the rest. And this little horn that grew stronger, we know now the Greek Empire was broken up into 4 different sections after Alexander the Great died. And it was with the 4 generals, and it was east, when east was the largest portion, because of like Syria, all the way to Iran, which is a very large piece of property. And then south, which is predominantly North Africa and Egypt. And then there was west, and then even further west. Well, the first part of west we called north, and then the other part was west. And those are the 4 horns. But the Seleucids, which is the general that was over that eastern portion, this is where this general comes from, that one of those horns that grows larger. We discovered that his name was Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was that little horn that came great. And he came around 168 AD. So if you look around, you'll see that Daniel was given a prophecy all the way back here. And we saw last week that God fulfilled lots of very specific prophecies about each one of these players, including Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's pretty amazing. And so we know that God has an amazing ability to know the future, and he revealed that to Daniel, and so we can trust both God and his word. Now, today we want to spend a little bit more time on this character, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll go back into the text. And so if you have your Bibles, you can get them ready in Daniel chapter 8. We're going to be looking at that pretty soon. But I want to tell you about this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was captured as a child because there was war amongst the different regions of the Greek Empire, and those that were in Rome, the western portion of the empire, they captured him, and he was kind of like a pawn for his dad. Somehow he gets back to Syria, and his dad dies. Now, his dad dies, his older brother, has the right to the throne. And so his older brothers are the ones supposed to be the 6th dynasty of the Seleucids. He's supposed to be leading the charge and taking over the world, but his brother dies somehow. He was murdered, obviously. And somehow, Antiochus Epiphanes, he finds his way to the top. He kind of deceitfully does a couple of things, obviously the murder of his brother, a couple other things, and he becomes the ruler of this large empire, this large portion of the Greek Empire. And he starts to expand it. He is very aggressive. He's kind of like a wild man. Pardon me. He's like a wild man. He's aggressive, and he starts to fight further east. He goes further north, and he even goes down into Egypt, and he conquers portions of Egypt, and he's quite powerful. But then he also goes over to the west, and of course we know southwest of Syria is, of course, Israel. And this is what the Bible refers to as the beautiful land. And so he goes into Israel, and fairly early in his rule, he goes over to Israel. He goes into Jerusalem, and he starts creating havoc. He takes and goes into the temple. He takes all of the primary articles that are made of gold and silver. He takes those. He takes all the gold and silver out of them. And he then takes and reappoints a different high priest over the temple, over the worship of the temple. Of course, that high priest is a very Jewish name. His name was Jason. Right. Well, some of you maybe not know, but Hebrew and Jason aren't necessarily the same. Jason is a Greek word, and we love Jason here. He's our worship pastor. But this Jason was a Greek guy who became the high priest of the Jewish religious system. I don't know how you do that, but he did that. And when he became high priest, of course, he brought all the Greek ideas into that place. And so there's lots of things that were difficult and changed. And one of the things he did, Jason built this amphitheater, a gymnasium of sorts, just to the bottom of the Temple Mount. And so just below the temple was this amphitheater where people could watch people do gymnastics and compete, like in the Olympic Games. Now, to us, people living in the 21st century, 22nd century here, we think, hey, yeah, Olympic Games, yes. But we're forgetting that the Jews were a little bit modest, and these people were running around naked, okay? And so that's a problem. That's a real problem. That's a big change in the culture, how we're going to do life and what it looks like when people, basically we go and we watch people run around naked doing these different games. And this is a big insult to and of course it's right down from the temple. And later on we find that he gets the priests to start to participate in some of these games. Now you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what that means and how that plays itself out. And some of you are aware that the Jews, they practice what's called circumcision. This goes all the way back to the promise of Abraham, way back 2,000 years before this, and God promised Abraham, and he said, upon this promise, and he had him circumcise himself, and then all of his children were supposed to be circumcised. So that's why Jews are circumcised, because they're from Father Abraham. Well, this is part of their promise. Well, this became a problem because the Greeks were like, that's not cool. And so now there's this whole thing going on that's happening to the culture. Antiochus Epiphanes now, he's starting to get more powerful, and he's kind of feeling himself. Now, he sees himself as a god. In fact, if you look at some of his coins and his time period, he calls himself the image of God, or rather the essence of God. And his name, he called himself, he got the title Antiochus, but his name Epiphanes, he put on himself. And Epiphanes means brilliant or great one, the greatest, basically. He's like Muhammad Ali, I'm the greatest. But even beyond that, he saw himself as a god. And on the coins it said Theos. He was calling himself God. This guy is kind of out of his mind. He's crazy, he's power hungry, and he's bent on Jerusalem. He comes back, he goes down to Egypt, and he's going to take over Egypt, he thought. But the Romans, who were actually more powerful than him at the time, they say, if you attack Egypt again, we're going to totally wipe you out. And for whatever reason, he says, okay, I'm not going to pick that battle. But on his way back from that fight, he's now ticked off. And the Ptolemies, thus the name of the group that was further south, who had control of Egypt, these people were rivals with him. And he was angry, and so he decides he's going to take out Jerusalem, and he does. He goes into Jerusalem, and he murders 80,000 people. And then he takes 40,000 people, and he makes them slaves. And then what he does is he goes into the temple. And now if you know the Jewish people, because of what God told them and their dietary things, they're not supposed to eat pork. And so anything to do with pigs or swine. And so what happens is he decides, I'm gonna show God and these people that I'm greater than they are. So he kills a pig on the altar in the Jewish temple. He erects statues of Zeus and Apollo. And what he does is then he takes that pig, he takes the blood from the pig and the pig's carcass, he puts it in water, he makes a slosh, and he mops the floor of the entire temple, all the different rooms and every space in it, with this ridiculous, terrible stuff. He defiles the entire temple of God. Then he takes the priest's quarters, where the priests would stay and had their responsibilities in different offices and whatever. He takes those quarters and he makes those into brothels. So now there's temple prostitution going on in the house of God, in the temple of God. We've sacrificed a pig in the temple of God, and we've erected other gods in this place. He's desecrated this place terribly. And then he's evil. He's evil beyond evil. He says, I don't want any other religion. I don't want anything else except Greek culture. So if you're not going to follow Greek culture, you Jewish people are going to die. So if you start following the Sabbath, if you decide you're going to circumcise your children, if you read the Word of God, if you have the Word of God on you, we will take it from you, we will burn it, and we will kill you. And that's what he did. He kept his promises. He was just that tyrannical. And so he would take and burned all the Bibles that he could find, all the scrolls, obviously, back in that time period. He burnt them, and if you had some, he would take them, burn them, and kill you. And then with women who decided that they wanted to honor God by having their babies circumcised on the 8th day, when he discovered that they were circumcised, he would then hang the babies and then hang them around their mothers' necks, and then he would crucify the moms with the babies on the mothers' necks. Or he would have them walk off a cliff with those babies already dead on their necks. Now, I don't know about you, but that is the most despicable, gruesome, evil, tormented, I don't know what, I can't find another word to describe how evil that really is. This guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, is terrible. He's demonic. He's being led by some other spirit. No normal human being, no matter how awful they are, would go to that length of terror. But he did. What we discovered, though, in his last battle, he goes up to Persia, and he's going to go up and fight against the sun god. And when he goes to go to their temple, he gets really, really sick, and he's on his deathbed. And he looks at his scribes, and he says, write this down. He says, you know what? I know why I'm sick and why I'm going to die. It's because I went against the God of the Jews, and I took stuff from the temple of God, and I defamed that temple. He knew at his death why he was going to die. And so this is interesting. Now I want you to turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 8. In Daniel before we do that, I just want to read one more thing. There's a guy named Josephus, and I think I have this quote over here. Josephus is a I think 2nd century Jewish historian, and he writes about these different time periods back in that time period. And by the way, if you want to study more about these things that we're talking about, obviously Daniel chapter 8 is big, but you can go to these other books, which we call apocryphal books. Some groups of churches believe that they're biblical. We do not believe that they're canonized or biblical, but we think they have some good history in them. And it's 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which tells the story about how this fight to push off Antiochus Epiphanes went. And so we see here, and Josephus writes, Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, now that's interesting, called Epiphanes. He called himself that. Of course, in the Greek language, he can call himself Epiphanes, and that would mean that he is actually a moron or a raging madman, as opposed to the brilliant, shining guy. But anyways, they would call him that, and he would call himself Epiphanes. But anyways, Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, a great sedition fell among the men of power in Judah, and came upon the Jews with a great army. He took their city by force and slew a great multitude and sent out his soldiers to plunder them without mercy. This guy is brutal. He also spoiled the temple and put a stop to the constant practice of offering and daily sacrifice, the morning and evening sacrifices. Next slide. Now, this is now chapter 2. Now, the Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking of the city. In other words, he wasn't dissatisfied with the first time he went and destroyed Jerusalem. Now he wants to go back at it again. Now he was not satisfied with the unexpected taking of the city, or with his pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there. But being overcome with his violent passions, he'd already killed 80,000 people and put 40,000 into slavery. He compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country. They now need to disobey God and obey him and be Greek, and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine flesh upon the altar. So now they have to continue, not just once, but they have to continue to sacrifice swine flesh and eat pigs, and he would make the priest eat the pig, okay? And against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death. In other words, those who actually wanted to follow God's law were put to death. Now, there's lots of other historical information around it, but I thought that paragraph there would give you a good idea that I'm not just making a lot of noise up here, that actually, historically, the things that happen with Antiochus Epiphanes are real and they're true. The last little piece I'll give you is that Antiochus, when his people were pushed out by the Maccabees, and Judas Maccabees comes in. There's a whole story behind that, but they come in and they wipe out a lot of his soldiers, and they retake the temple and they cleanse the temple. And this is where we called the Feast of Dedication, which is actually what the Jewish people call Hanukkah. And this Hanukkah was started because on that day, December 25th, I think 165 BC, they were able to cleanse the temple, and they had just one thing of oil, and they had this lamp. Now, to you and me, just go get more oil. But the problem was they were trying to cleanse the temple and make it back to what God told them to do. And there was a process spelled out for them in the book of Leviticus on how to purify the oil, and it took about 7 to 8 days. And so they only had one thing of that. And so now the problem is that's only going to last for one day. But this is what's so miraculous about Hanukkah. Not only did they kick this guy out of the temple and re-cleanse it, but then they lit this lamp, and it lasted for 8 days until they can get new oil. And so the lamp has never gone out. And so that was the miracle that they celebrate at Hanukkah, and that's why they celebrate for 8 days. So I want us to go now to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to jump down to verse 9. He says, out of one of them came another horn. So now we're talking about the prophecy that Daniel gave in earlier part about that goat. Remember the goat with the 4 horns? Okay. So that goat, which is Greece, out of one of the 4 horns, started a small but grew in power to the south, to the east, and toward the beautiful land. Now it's interesting, every time we see in the prophecies of Daniel the directions of these beasts, which are referring to countries or leaders, those are absolutely the historical directions and the order of which they actually attacked to build their strength. Just like we saw with the Medo-Persian Empire, and just like we saw with the Greco Empire, we see the same with Antiochus Epiphanes, that when he starts to the south, and then to the east, and then towards the beautiful land, and that's what we saw. Okay? It grew until it reached the host of heavens. Now, it meaning this horn. So it's referring specifically to the person, Antiochus Epiphanes. So now he's going up against the people of Israel, the Jewish people. So you might think the host of heavens are the stars, but what he's really referring to is the Jewish people. He says he reached the host of heavens and threw some of the starry host down to the earth. The starry host are the ones that shine most brilliantly. The ones, we can have, just like in any church or any place, you can have people who call themselves Christians, but not everyone who comes to church is a Christian. And that's okay. We want them to come to know Christ and follow him. It's the same thing with the Jewish people. Just because they were born Jewish doesn't mean they actually love God or believe him or want to follow him. So when he attacked the Jewish people, that was one thing. But then he threw the starry ones, the ones who actually wanted to follow God, onto the earth and trampled them to death. And that's exactly what he did. In fact, those who really wanted to follow God, he made their life terrible. It says it, meaning the horn, going back to Antiochus Epiphanes, set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. Wow. So now he's bigger than God, and it took away the daily sacrifices from the Lord. He did that. And his sanctuary was thrown down because of the rebellion. The Lord's people and the daily sacrifice was given over to it. It prospered in everything it did. Now this is a translation. And when we have other languages like Hebrew, this is not, we would think prospered and he made great money on his investment and everything. No, it means that everything he put his hand to, he succeeded. And so he prospered in everything he did, and the truth was thrown to the ground. This is exactly what we see. Everything that's written in this prophecy is exactly what happened to Antiochus Epiphanes. He was this terrible, demonic-type guy who came in and just terrorized the Jews. He destroyed the temple. He stopped the worship and he stopped the sacrifices. He defiled the temple, and he did these terrible things. And he threw the Bible, destroyed the Bible, and he killed people who wanted to follow God. It's really, really very descriptive and very precise. Let's keep going. So in the latter part of their reign, okay? So this means, so in Daniel chapter 8, the vision comes, and so Daniel sees the vision. And then in the latter part of Daniel chapter 8, Gabriel is explaining to Daniel what those visions mean. And so now this is the explanation that Gabriel gives that was there before. So in verse 23, he says, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels had become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds a whole lot like this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. This fierce-looking king, his face was set, is actually what it means in Hebrew. It's this idea that he's determined type personality. He's completely wicked, of course he was, will arise, and he was a master of intrigue. Well, having your brother murdered and getting yourself on the throne would be pretty intriguing. And he will become very strong, but not by his own power. Well, think about that for a second. Is this all because Antiochus Epiphanes is this great, brilliant leader? Or was there someone else behind the scene who was setting the stage, doing some things? Well, this is what the prophecy is telling us. Daniel is being told by God himself that Satan is going to have power here with Antiochus Epiphanes. That Satan's going to be a player here. And so Satan is either possessing this guy or he's giving him a lot of influence and power, because it says he came very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation. And I think when you walk into a city and kill 80,000 people, and then put 40,000 to slavery, you've done some devastation along with other things that he's did. And he will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty. And when he's talking about this word mighty, doesn't actually mean strong in strength. It means strong in their faith. So he did he not? The people he targeted were those who actually were willing to abide by God's law and fulfill what God told them to do as Jews, to obey the Abrahamic covenant. Those people, he killed, the holy people of God. Okay, that's pretty crazy. What we see is that Antiochus Epiphanes totally fulfilled the prophecies that were given here in the book of Daniel, chapter 8. And we see that pretty clearly. Let's look at verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking. Now, Daniel had got the prophecy, the vision, okay? And in the middle of Daniel chapter 8, we talked about this a little bit last week. Now, all of a sudden, there are these two people. We don't know exactly who the one person is. It could be what we would say the pre-incarnate Christ. Could very well be. We don't know for certain. But we do know that this person who's standing there, who looks like a person but has this great authority because he tells an angel what to do, and not just any angel, but the angel Gabriel what to do. There is this person, and then there is this angel, Gabriel, and they're talking. It says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him," so maybe two angels are talking to each other, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled?" So now the angels are asking God, like, can you tell us what's going on here? How long? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the rebellion that causes desolation. And so this rebellion that causes desolation is the Jewish people. When Jason went in and became high priest, they started to participate with all the Greek activity, put away their religion. They stopped doing what God asked them to do. They started to do what the Greeks were doing. And this was a rebellion against God. The vision concerning this daily sacrifice is the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. I mean, that's exactly what happened. And so these angels are like, how long does that terribleness has to take place? Well, let's take a look. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. It will be cleaned. And that's interesting, because if you look in your history book, you'll discover on September 6, 171 BC, September 6, 171 BC, that's when Antiochus Epiphanes went into Jerusalem the first time. And that's when he caused all the problems, and that's when he set Jason up to be the high priest. You know what? When the Maccabees walk into the temple, take out his troops, and they reconcentrate the temple, and they light that lamp. You know what day that is? Oh, it's December 25th, 165 BC. You know how many days it is between those two dates? Can anyone want to take a guess? Well, it's interesting how God prophesied over 300 years before, almost 400 years before this was going to happen, the exact amount of days from when this beast, Antiochus Epiphanes, would come and cause all this havoc and do these terrible things, and to when he is going to be taken out and when the temple will be restored. In fact, 2,300 days are exactly what the Bible teaches us, is exactly what history tells us. That's pretty amazing. So we see then that God is able to keep his word, and we see then that those things have occurred. But let's take another look here at what Gabriel says to Daniel. Daniel chapter 8, verse 17. Look at verse B. The second part of this passage says, "Son of man," so we're starting here, "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns," can you say it with me, "the time of the end." So what's confusing here is that this vision is actually being fulfilled in those second two kingdoms, those middle two kingdoms, the Medo-Persian and the Greeks. The vision is being fulfilled by this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. But yet, even though they are being fulfilled there, the angel is telling Daniel that yes, they will be fulfilled then, but they actually signal something at the end. And when we look at the other two prophecies, we know that Daniel was aware that there was another kingdom coming after the Greeks. So this fulfillment of Antiochus Epiphanes was not the end. This was not the Antichrist, but this was someone much like the Antichrist. In fact, he was a precursor. He showed us just how brutal and how evil, how terrible this leader will be. And so he says, understand that the vision concerns a time of the end. Let's go to the next phrase here. He said in verse 19, I'm going to tell you, Gabriel, I'm going to tell you, Daniel, what will happen later in the time of wrath. Later in the time of wrath. In other words, you had this vision, terrible stuff happened, but there's going to be a time, it's called both in Isaiah and Jeremiah and in the book of Revelation and Daniel chapter 9, the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time, can you say it with me, of the end. So this vision has this prophecy has two fulfillments. The one that's being fulfilled directly about 300 or 400 years later with Antiochus Epiphanes, but then this prophecy is yet to be fulfilled about the end. We're talking about now the Antichrist. And so go ahead, the next verse. Now in verse 26, he says, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been given you is true. But seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. Can you say it with me? Because it concerns what? The distant future. So Daniel's getting this prophecy that's connected to these two kingdoms that are sitting in the middle of the visions that he's had before. sitting in the middle of what he knows is not the end. And so I think the angel is making very clear to Daniel that yes, this is going to happen. Yes, a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes is going to come. He's going to do these terrible things to the Jews. But he is just a precursor. He's the one who actually shows you kind of shows you an example of what it's going to look like when the Antichrist comes. And we're going to talk more about him because he's listed both. We saw that in Daniel 7, and we're going to see him in Daniel 9:11 and also in Revelation. And so he says here, the visions of the evenings and the mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal it up, for the concerns the distant future. Now, what does he mean, seal it up? What does that mean? If Daniel was supposed to seal up this vision, why are we reading about it? Why was it in the book of Daniel? Doesn't make any sense, right? If Daniel was supposed to seal up this vision, then no one was supposed to have it. No, that's not what that word means, because obviously if it meant that, Daniel wouldn't have put it in Daniel chapter 8 so we could see it. Daniel wrote it. He wrote it, right away, and we've had this vision for 2,500 years. And so what it means by seal it up, it means make it strong, make it not go away, make it so it's something that you remember, keep it safe, make sure that we're aware of it, keep it in front of your mind. Know that the fact is that there's one who's coming, who's the Antichrist, who's going to be terrible, and there's going to be a terrible time of wrath, and terrible things are going to happen in front of you. Daniel, don't forget this vision. He says, seal it up, for it concerns the distant future. Don't let go of it, because it's going to be needed. The vision needs to be in front of us for a long period of time. So I want you to look at this little chart with me, if you can. So this is kind of, all of the things we talked about before kind of go all the way here. So we got Babylon, we've got the Medes and the Persians, we've got the Greeks, we've got Antiochus Epiphanes, okay? And then Jesus comes, right? And Jesus comes and he rises again. He dies on the cross and rises again. But then we have this thing called the church age. We have no idea how long this thing called the church age is. We're living now in the church age. And in this church age, what Paul says, he says that God has made it a mystery. He concealed it even from the heavens, that the angels didn't know about the church age. Satan didn't know about the church age. No one knew about the church age except God the Father. He concealed it and made it a mystery, and now has been revealed to us. And so we have this break from all of the prophecies that you're going to see in Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel 9 and 11. There's going to be a break, and Pastor Isaac will talk more about that next week and the weeks following. But then we have this break because there's this age called the church age. We have no idea how long it's going to be. It might be another 5,000 years. It might be tomorrow Jesus comes back. I really hope so. The only reason why I don't want Jesus to come back is because maybe some of you don't know him as your Savior. And maybe some of your friends and coworkers and neighbors and his classmates don't know Jesus as their Savior, haven't been forgiven. And if Christ comes back, that's a really bad day for them. But if you know him, it's a great day. When he comes back here, he's not going to come back to reign and rule yet. He's just going to come back to take his people in the air. We call that the rapture. Jesus is going to come and take the church out. Why? Because remember we talked about that time of trouble? That's called the tribulation. There's going to be 7 years of great suffering on the earth. God is going to judge all the nations of the world, and he's going to do it multiple ways. And one of the ways he's going to do it, he's going to let a delusion come along, and people are going to start following this leader. Heard that before. This leader who now is going to unite the entire world under one system, one economy, and everyone's going to be like, yay, great leader, we love you, we think you're great. And then next thing you know, he's going to set himself up at the temple. He's going to declare himself to be God and demand everyone worship him. That's fun. And if you don't, you're going to die. And now we have this great tribulation, a lot of persecution against the people of God, against the Jews, against those who decide to follow God in that time period. And then God himself is going to bring a bunch of judgments. And if you read in Revelations, you'll discover the bowl judgments. We have the seals and the trumpets, and there's these terrible things. In fact, by the time you get to the end of this tribulation period, only a third of the people who lived on the earth in the beginning are going to be alive. They're going to be able to go into what's called the millennial kingdom. And what happens here is Christ is going to come back, and he's going to rule on the throne. And he's going to take Satan and the beast, and he's going to take the Antichrist and all of those demons. He's going to throw those guys in the lake of fire and chain them for 1,000 years. And we call that the millennial reign of Christ. Christ will reign on this throne. And people will be like, yay, 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 because now they have a just king, a just government. Hey, no government overreach, because the perfect one who knows exactly what the balance is making all the decisions. We have a just king sitting on the throne. You would think now people are going to live longer. They're not going to die. There's going to be, the lamb and the lion are going to be able to sit next to each other. There's going to be disease is going to be stopped. We have this amazing season for 1,000 years where Christ is ruling on the throne. Now, you would think that now that Jesus has come and we're able to have him here, that everyone will be so happy. But what's true about our human nature? We're full of pride. Each one of us is full of pride. And because we're full of pride, we don't want anyone to govern us. And so after 1,000 years of having Jesus govern us, the people who are living in this millennial time period are going to be like, we're done with it. And God is going to give man one more opportunity to choose him or reject him. And sadly, many people will reject him. And so he's going to release Satan and the demons from this holding place. And now he's going to let them have influence one more time. And Satan's going to come with all of his fury, all of his anger, all of his power. And he's going to dilute all these people that don't want to follow God anymore. And they're going to try to fight God, which is the most ridiculous thing in the universe. God's going to come. He's going to wipe them out. This is the end of all battles. And now God is going to destroy the whole world with fire at the end. And every human being who's ever lived in the time past up to the time present is going to have to stand before God and give an account of their life. And God's going to open up the books. He's going to open up the books, and there's one book. It's called the Lamb's Book of Life. That means Jesus' book. Those who place their faith in the Lamb, their names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And their salvation and their forgiveness has been purchased by his blood. And your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. You're not going to be cast into outer darkness where there's no weeping and gnashing of teeth for eternity. That's called, we say it's hell, but that's not. It's called the lake of fire. It's eternal state. And then the people who have been, names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, they're going to be able to go back and be with God, but no longer will they have a sin nature. And no longer will there be sin. No longer will there be death. There'll be no more tears. There'll be no more crying. There'll be none of that ever again, because God will be their God. And what will happen is God's destroying this earth and the heavens with fire, and he's making a new heaven and a new earth. And he's going to bring down a city he's been working on for a few days. He's going to bring that city down onto the earth, and all of us will live there for eternity. Now, we don't fully know what we're going to do, but we know we're not going to sit on clouds and play, our harps. There's lots that God's going to have for us. He made us creative. He's eternally intelligent. So I'm sure he's got lots of things that we're going to be doing for eternity with him. I just don't know what all of those things are. But what we will have is peace, freedom, forgiveness of sin, relationship with God, and that whole thing. So that's what's going on ahead of us. This is what we look forward to. Okay, I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Then I want you to say one more thing. Just go before we end here. Daniel chapter 8, verse 27. Daniel says, I, Daniel, was exhausted, and I was worn out, and I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't blame Daniel at all. I'd be exhausted too. If I was sitting here having watched this vision, if I would have been next to the angel Gabriel and probably the pre-incarnate Christ, if I would have been told about the pain and suffering and the agony that my people were going to have to go through, and how the temple was going to be desecrated like that, and how other people were going to be killed, and how this terrible ruler was going to come and do these terrible things, I think I'd be like, oh my word, I don't want any of this. And I think Daniel was saddened and appalled. He knew it was in front of him. And even though he knows God's going to win, even though he knows at the end God's going to make it all right, there's this whole journey in front of him that makes him sad. The thing that I find interesting about this is in the very middle sentence here. It says, maybe see if you can read out loud wherever you are. Then I got up and went about the king's business. So what can we take away from today? Well, there's probably tons of things, and we could stay longer, but some of you actually want to go eat supper or lunch or something. Listen, one of the things is He prepares us for what's to come. God is allowing us to have a little bit of a window into the future so that we can be prepared for what's to come. You know, because Daniel saw this dream, this vision, and he understood the vision and the meaning of the vision, he knew that King Belshazzar, who was the king of the Babylonians at that time, was not going to be anything, that the Medes and Persians were going to come. And so we know, 6, 8 years later, we don't know exactly the time, when Belshazzar calls him in, because on the wall was written many, many tekel upharsin, and he didn't know how to interpret it, so he brought Daniel in. He says to Daniel, hey, Daniel, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. And Daniel's like, you can keep your gold and your kingdom, because it's not going to last very long. Tonight, your soul has been actually given over, and your kingdom's been taken from your hand. Unbelievable. Daniel had that kind of confidence because he already had seen from this vision what was true about the future. We can have confidence in how we live out our lives too, because God is teaching us about the future. The other thing is when we walk into different situations, we have different eyes, just like we talked about with Daniel. Because we know God is going to win at the end, we don't have to get all worked up about the difficulty that we're dealing with in the immediate. And it deepens our faith. It also warns us that one day there will be a one world leader. And we don't have to be falling for that delusion or have our friends fall for that delusion. We can actually be prepared for when that crisis starts to happen, we can start to manage ourselves. 1 Peter says, live out the time here with reverent fear. We don't need to grieve or give up. We need to get up and get about our Father's business. The one thing I would say to you, two things I want to say to you in closing. One is I think we need to have this heart of Daniel where he says he was grieved. We need to be grieved too. I think our hearts need to be broken and hurting, because we know that there's a lot of pain yet in front of us before the end comes. And there's a lot of people who are going to be deceived and hurting between now and then. And my prayer is that we can be motivated, not out of guilt and weird stuff, but just out of common sense. You know what? I don't want my friend, my neighbor, my coworker, my family member, my classmate to have to go through any of that. I want them to know the forgiveness that Christ has to offer. And I'm praying that we can grieve a little bit so that we might be more motivated to say, I'm going to work harder to bring Christ to others. But the second thing that I really want to say here is that Daniel is clear in that verse. Even though he was worn out, he took a rest. And even though he was sad, he got up and he went about the king's business. You know what? Your friend, your neighbor, your coworker, the things that are happening in your world, they need you to be present. And if you're so busy, thinking about these other things and trying to figure out when Jesus is going to come and all that, he doesn't tell us the day. He tells us he's coming. And so we need to be ready today. So let's get about the king's business. What is God asking you to do today? Let's be faithful to what he's asked us to do. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for prophecy.